Let's begin looking at Donald Gustafson's essay, Grief. This video will focus just on section 1, which is a brief introduction. It's very short, so I will indulge myself and actually read it aloud here. I think that might be a good way of getting started. This is an academic essay written by a professional philosopher, more or less for other professional philosophers. So it may not be the easiest thing in the world to read. So just to get started, I'm going to start reading aloud and freely commenting on it. But let me say that the main thing that you should get out of this first section, this introductory section, is a notion of what he's trying to do in this essay. Traditional and recent philosophical writing about the emotions contains almost nothing about the emotion of grief. This could hardly be a mere oversight. Perhaps grief is not, as such and properly, an emotion. For instance, classical Greek seems not to have had a word for grief other than the term for pain. So it's clear that right away what Gustafson is getting into is a lack of some existing philosophical account of the specific emotion, grief. That is, there's all sorts of philosophical literature about the emotions in general, but not much about the specific emotion of grief. And one of the reasons may be, as the Greek language, the ancient Greek language would imply, is that there is no such specific emotion. The Greeks didn't have a word specifically for grief. They just used the word pain. So he continues, or perhaps grief, though an emotion, is of a special sort, or grief is overly complex for typical philosophical analysis. Sorrow is perhaps simpler and an appropriate paradigm for the type of which grief, too, is a case. What we'll see is that for him, sorrow is a larger, broader, more general, even vaguer type of emotion. But I think one way you can think of his eventual definition of grief, because he certainly will try to define grief, that's the whole point of the essay, is that it's a specific form or species of the wider idea of the wider emotion of sorrow. I will not now assess these speculations concerning the absence of accounts of grief in the philosophical literature. Rather, I shall propose an account of grief, the emotion called grief. So he is going to give an account, more or less a definition of what grief is. Among the things an account of this concept should yield in the end is an explanation of the relative absence of considerations of grief in the standard theories of emotion. Maybe he'll explain why there has hitherto been no actual specific account of what grief is. In what follows, I will begin with the collection of some of the data relevant to an account of the emotions generally and of grief specifically. So I'm going to start out in section 2 with an account of, let's say, philosophical thinking on the emotions in general, and then move to a specific account of grief. In light of these, I will formulate some of the desiderata, some of the things we want for an account of grief. Any account must relate grief to other affective and cognitive states. Now, an affective state is, let's say, a state of feeling of some sort. And a cognitive state is a state of belief of some sort. These terms we'll discuss this more in later videos, but affective really means having to do with feeling, and cognitive having to do with knowledge or belief. An account, must relate grief to other affective and cognitive states. In this connection, it will be helpful to compare and contrast grief with some of its near neighbors among the emotions, with special attention to sorrow. That is, how does grief differ from just sorrow, is one of the things we'll have to explain. And I shall proceed on the hypothesis that there are conditions of rationality for the various emotions, and that attention to these will help to distinguish grief from, say, pain and then sorrow. Now, we'll get into this later, but conditions of rationality basically are setting out criteria for the rationality of feeling an emotion. For instance, the conditions of rationality for rage might be that something truly awful has happened or something truly bad has happened. Whereas it would be rational to get into a state of rage if you witness something outrageous. It would be irrational to get into a state of rage if you overcooked your soft-boiled egg, just to give you a notion. This will prove to be a reasonable hypothesis if, on its basis, we are able to distinguish grief as a specific emotion. So, again, that's the big idea here. That's what he wants to do with this essay, is to distinguish grief as a specific emotion. That is, to give the conditions under which we could say that someone is actually grieving, the specific conditions that would need to be fulfilled to say this person is grieving. In contrast to the classical view of grief as merely a form of pain with distinctive causes. That is, okay, we could say, and he does say right away in the second section, we could just define grief, as he says right here in the beginning of section 2, as a deep unhappiness essentially tied to a belief or judgment that someone has died. That would be a form of pain with distinctive causes. He wants to get more granular. He wants to get more particular about what grief is. And it's not just sadness because someone has died. There's something else there. There's something more distinctive about grief. And finally, he says, throughout, I have assumed that grief is a distinct emotion, different from pain and from sorrow. Certainly, I think he means to say that grief involves pain and sorrow, but it is distinct from just general pain or general sorrow. So a lot of these things that he's introduced will come up later in the essay, and I will explain them further in my my video commentary on the later sections. However, the big idea here is that he's trying to define grief as a specific emotion.